I'm 28 male, living in a small town where everyone seems to know each other's business, especially when it comes to family matters. Growing up, I was the odd one out in my family, the middle child sandwiched between my older brother, Chris, and my younger sister, Megan. My parents always seemed to dote on them, while I got used to being the independent one, the kid who had it all together. Chris had a rough time in his early 20s. He struggled with addiction for years. It put a lot of strain on our family, especially my parents. Rehab wasn't cheap, and they drained most of their savings trying to help him get better. Megan, on the other hand, always had a creative side. She's studying art in college, and my parents have always supported her dreams, covering her tuition, rent, and whatever else she needs. I guess I can't blame them. Chris had his struggles, and Megan was their bright star. But that left me in the shadows, the one they didn't have to worry about. 3 years ago, I moved back to town after living in the city for a few years. I became a nurse, working long shifts, sometimes nights. I came back because, honestly, I felt guilty. Chris was in and out of rehab back then, and I thought maybe being closer to the family would make a difference. My parents had hinted that I should help out more, and part of me wanted to prove that I could still be a good son. So I moved back, hoping things would change. But here's the reality: they didn't. Despite me being around, it's like I'm still invisible. Family dinners are awkward, to say the least. My parents and Megan talk about Chris's progress or Megan's latest art projects. I try to join the conversation, but they always seem more interested in whatever my siblings are up to. Even if I mention something about my life or work, the topic changes pretty quickly. It's like my presence doesn't really matter, even though I've been helping out in ways they don't seem to notice. When I moved back, my parents were struggling financially, especially after paying for Chris's treatments. So I started sending them money every month, hoping to ease their burden. Part of that money goes to Megan's tuition, something I wasn't really asked to do but felt like I should. Even with that, Megan treats me like I'm some kind of outsider. I'll try to ask her about her studies or her art, and she barely gives me the time of day. It's always a quick answer before she moves on to talk with our parents. I'm engaged, too, to a great woman who's seen all of this firsthand. She's been telling me for a while that I need to set boundaries with my family, that it's not my job to carry their financial problems on my back. But I always thought, well, they're my family. I should help out. I figured things would get better eventually, that they'd appreciate what I was doing. Then, there was my birthday a few months ago. I turned 28, and it passed by like any other day. No calls, no messages from my parents or Megan. Just a quiet dinner with my fiancé. A month earlier, for Megan's birthday, my parents threw her this huge celebration. They invited all our relatives, made a big deal out of it. But for mine, nothing. It hurt, but I kept telling myself not to take it personally. Maybe they just forgot. The real blow came during a family barbecue a few weeks after that. I wasn't eavesdropping or anything, but I ended up overhearing my parents and siblings talking about me. They didn't know I was nearby, and I heard my mom say something like, well, we just have to tolerate him. It was like a punch to the gut. I walked away before they saw me, trying to hold back the sting of it. That night, I finally broke down in front of my fiancée. I told her everything. How I've always felt like the odd one out. How I don't understand why I keep helping when they clearly don't care. She wasn't surprised, and she told me again that I need to start focusing on us and not just my family. It's not that I didn't see her point, it's just hard to shake off that sense of obligation. A few days later, I tried to confront my parents about it. I told them how it hurt to hear those things, that I've been doing my best to support the family, and that I'd like a little appreciation in return. My mom just waved it off, saying I was being too sensitive, that I should be happy Chris is sober now, and that Megan has a bright future. My dad didn't say much, he just sat there nodding along. It felt like I was talking to a wall. I wasn't sure what to do after that, so I did something I never thought I'd do. I turned to Reddit, made an anonymous post in one of those subs where people vent about their family issues. I laid it all out, how I've been supporting my parents, how they don't seem to appreciate it, how Megan gets everything handed to her while I'm treated like I'm just there. I asked if I was being petty, or if my feelings were valid. I didn't expect much from it, maybe a few responses telling me to suck it up. Instead, the comments poured in, hundreds of people telling me that my family was using me, that I needed to put myself first for once. They called out how my parents were taking advantage of my kindness, and how Megan seemed entitled to the help I've been giving. A lot of people said I should cut them off entirely, but it's not that simple, you know? Still, the more I read, the more I started to think that maybe my fiancé has been right all along. Maybe I do need to draw a line somewhere. So I made a decision. I was going to stop sending money for Megan's tuition and start focusing on my own future. It's not like I don't care about my family, but I can't keep putting myself last. And when I told my parents, well, let's just say they didn't take it well. Update 1. After reading through all the advice on Reddit, I decided it was time to draw a line. I needed to focus on my own future, and that meant cutting off the monthly payments for Megan's tuition. With my wedding coming up and a house to save for, I couldn't keep draining my finances. So I called my parents, figuring it was best to explain the situation directly. The call started off fine, small talk about the weather, how work was going. But when I got to the main point, things shifted quickly. I told them I wouldn't be able to keep sending money for Megan's school anymore. My mom's tone changed instantly. She couldn't believe I would abandon Megan like that, especially when she was so close to finishing her degree. She went on, saying how they had always relied on me, and now I was turning my back on the family. My dad didn't say much, but I could hear him sigh in the background. After that, the guilt tripping began. My mom kept asking how I could do this to my own sister, insisting that I was being selfish and only thinking about myself. She brought up my upcoming wedding, implying that I was choosing to prioritize a party over my sister's future. I tried to stay calm, but it felt like talking to a brick wall. I reminded her that I've been helping for years, that I've put off my own needs time and time again. She didn't seem to care. Eventually, I had to end the call before things got any more heated. It didn't take long for Megan to chime in. She sent me a long text message that evening, basically blaming me for ruining her life. According to her, I was the reason she wouldn't be able to finish her degree, and she accused me of being jealous of her dreams. The message was filled with angry words, saying I only cared about my own selfish little life and not about the family. I read it over a few times, feeling a mix of frustration and disbelief. I didn't even bother responding. Thankfully, my fiancée backed me up. She kept reminding me that it was okay to focus on our future, that I wasn't obligated to keep sacrificing for my family, especially when they didn't appreciate it. She reminded me that it was my money, my decision, and that we had our own lives to build together. It helped, but the whole situation still sat heavily on my mind. Chris reached out a few days later. He didn't pick a side, which didn't surprise me. He just said he understood why I was upset, but he also felt like our parents needed the help. He suggested that I might want to reconsider, at least for Megan's sake. I appreciated that he was trying to be a peacemaker, but it wasn't the support I'd hoped for. It felt like he was stuck in the middle, trying to keep everyone happy, and I couldn't really blame him for that. After that, my parents stopped talking to me altogether. They'd respond to my texts, but only if it was directly about Megan's tuition, as if nothing else mattered. If I tried to bring up anything else, there was radio silence. It was like I'd been cut out of their lives, all because I wasn't willing to keep paying for Megan's school. It stung, but I tried to push through it. I decided to post an update on Reddit. I shared how the conversation with my parents had gone and how Megan had reacted. It felt good to let it all out, even if I wasn't sure how people would respond. The comments came in quickly, with a lot of people saying I was doing the right thing, that my family had been taking advantage of me for too long. Some people shared their own stories about setting boundaries with family, which made me feel less alone. But there were also a few comments suggesting that I should try to be more understanding, that maybe Megan was just desperate. I wasn't sure what to think anymore. A week later, my parents showed up at my house without warning. My fiancé and I were just sitting down for dinner when I heard a knock at the door. I opened it to see them standing there, looking upset. They didn't waste any time, asking me why I was being so cruel to Megan. My mom's voice was shaky, and my dad looked uncomfortable. They kept pressing, saying how much Megan needed my support and how it wasn't right to leave her struggling. I stood my ground, explaining that I couldn't keep sacrificing my own plans and my own future for Megan's benefit. I told them I had already done more than my share, that it was time for me to focus on my own life. My mom's reaction was immediate. She started crying, saying that I was abandoning them all over again, just like when I moved away from my nursing job years ago. She talked about how hard it was back then when Chris was at his worst, how they'd felt like they'd lost me. My fiancé stepped in at that point. She tried to be polite but firm, asking my parents to leave and respect our decision. She told them that this was our home, our life, and that they couldn't just show up to pressure me like this. My dad finally spoke up, trying to calm my mom down, but she was already too worked up. Eventually, they left in a huff, my mom vowing that they'd never come back to our house again. The door shut, and there was a long silence. My fiancé squeezed my hand, but I could tell she was just as shaken by the whole scene as I was. After they left, I felt a mix of emotions, relief that I'd stood my ground, but also a heavy sense of guilt. I couldn't help but wonder if I'd made the right choice, especially when I logged back into Reddit and saw some comments criticizing me for not being more compassionate. They said family is family, that I should have tried harder to work things out. It made me second-guess myself, and I started to doubt whether I'd done the right thing. But deep down, I knew I couldn't keep living my life the way I had been, always trying to please everyone else. It's been a few days since the confrontation, and my parents haven't reached out. Megan hasn't either. I'm not sure what comes next, but I'm trying to stay strong, even with that nagging doubt in the back of my mind. Update 2. After that confrontation at my house, things went quiet. My parents, who used to message me regularly, even if it was just about Megan's tuition, went completely silent. Megan, who had been quick to throw blame my way, didn't reach out either. It was like I had been cut out of the family, but this time they weren't trying to guilt trip me into coming back. Chris sent me a brief text asking how I was holding up, but that was about it. For 2 weeks, it stayed like that, radio silence. At first, I tried to focus on my wedding plans and my work, but there was this nagging feeling that I should reach out. My fiancé encouraged me to use this time to focus on us, but the absence of communication from my family still weighed on me. Then, out of the blue, my mom called me late one evening. I almost didn't pick up, thinking it was probably going to be another round of guilt tripping. But something told me to answer, and when I did, her voice wasn't angry. It was desperate. She told me she needed help covering an unexpected medical bill. She wouldn't go into details, but she made it sound urgent. It caught me off guard. After weeks of being ignored, now they needed my help again. I didn't respond right away. I told her I'd think about it, then hung up and sat there staring at my phone. My fiancé asked what the call was about, and when I told her, she just shook her head, saying they always seemed to come back to me when they needed something. She wasn't wrong, and it made me pause. I knew that if I helped out, it would be like opening the door again to all the pressure they used to put on me. But if I didn't help, it would feel like turning my back on my own mother during a tough time. I decided to post on Reddit again, laying out the situation and asking if I should stick to my boundaries or give in this one time. The responses poured in, with most people urging me to stay strong and not fall back into old habits. They pointed out that my family had no problem cutting me off when I was no longer useful to them, and now that they needed something, they were back. A lot of people warned that if I gave in now, it would set a precedent that they could keep using me whenever they wanted. In the end, I decided to send my mom a small amount, but I made it very clear that it was a one-time thing. I texted her, explaining that I couldn't afford to support them like I used to because I had my own expenses and future to plan for. I didn't get much of a response, just a cold thanks and nothing more. It was like she had taken what she needed and shut the door again. My fiancée wasn't too happy about my decision. She told me she understood why I did it, but she was frustrated that I didn't stick to the boundaries I'd tried to set. She worried that this would just pull me back into the same cycle I'd been trying to break. It was hard to argue with her, but I hoped this would be the last time I'd have to deal with something like this. A few days later, Megan decided to stir things up. She went on social media and made a long post about how I had abandoned the family when they needed me most. She talked about how our parents had sacrificed so much for us, and now that they were struggling, I had turned my back on them. The post didn't mention my name directly, but it wasn't hard to figure out who she was talking about. Some of our extended family members saw the post and reached out to me, asking what was going on. A few of them took Megan's side, telling me I should be ashamed for letting my parents down when they were struggling. They had no idea about the years I'd spent helping out, about all the money I'd sent for Megan's tuition, or the sacrifices I'd made. It was like they only knew Megan's side of the story, and that was enough for them. I felt a surge of anger and hurt seeing those messages. It was one thing for my immediate family to act like this, but for them to paint me as the bad guy to everyone else? That felt like a new low. My fiancé suggested I should just block them and focus on the people who actually understood the situation, but it was hard to let it go. I thought about responding, but it felt like it would just add fuel to the fire. Then, I found out that my parents had hosted a family reunion, one of those get-togethers with the extended family that they used to do every summer. Except this time, I wasn't invited. Chris mentioned it casually, like he assumed I already knew, and I had to pretend that I didn't care. But deep down, it stung to realize that I was the only one left out. It was like they were making a point that I wasn't part of the family anymore. A few days after the reunion, Chris reached out again. He apologized for how things had turned out, saying he was sorry that I felt so isolated from everyone. He said he was trying to stay neutral, but it was clear he was struggling with the whole situation too. He kept saying he wished things could just go back to the way they were before all the drama, but I knew that wasn't going to happen. Talking to him, I realized that I couldn't keep letting my family's actions control my life. I was tired of bending over backwards just to feel like I belonged. I told Chris that I appreciated him reaching out, but I needed to move on and focus on my own future now. I didn't want to cut him out, but I couldn't keep putting myself in the middle of this mess. With that decision, I felt a new resolve. I blocked Megan on social media to avoid seeing any more of her rants. I stopped checking my phone constantly, hoping for some sign that my parents had changed their minds. Instead, I turned my attention back to planning my wedding and building a life with my fiancé, one where I didn't have to keep wondering if I was ever going to be good enough for my family. I don't know what will happen next, but for the first time in a while, I'm trying to put myself first. It's not easy, but it feels like the only way forward. Update 3. With my family barely speaking to me, I tried to put all my energy into planning my wedding. My fiancé and I dove into the details: venue, catering, the guest list. We were excited to make it our special day, but the whole thing felt clouded by the silence from my family. Despite everything that had happened, I still hoped for a reconciliation. So I decided to send invitations to my parents, Chris, and even Megan. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the olive branch that could mend things. Weeks passed without any response from them. The RSVP deadline came and went, and my parents didn't even acknowledge the invite. Chris didn't say anything either. Then, one evening, a message from Megan popped up on my phone. It wasn't what I'd hoped for. She called my wedding a sham, claiming she wouldn't attend even if she was paid to. I read the message a couple of times, wondering how it had come to this point. But instead of replying, I just put my phone down and tried to move on. As the date got closer, the pressure started to mount. My fiancé saw how much it was getting to me and suggested that maybe we should just elope. She thought it might be better to skip the drama altogether and have a day that was just about us. I knew she meant well, but I wasn't ready to give up on the wedding we'd planned. I felt like I deserved this celebration, even if my family wasn't going to be there. So, we pressed on, hoping that things might change at the last minute. One night, Chris called me out of the blue. It was late, and I almost let it go to voicemail, but I answered. He sounded conflicted, like he was caught in the middle of a tug of war. He said he wished the family could just get along again, and that it was hard watching everyone fall apart like this. He hinted that our parents thought I was acting out for attention. Hearing that hurt, but I didn't argue with him. He seemed genuinely torn, but it wasn't enough to change anything. Not long after that call, I decided to make one last effort. I wrote an email to my parents, pouring out everything I'd been holding back. I told them how much it hurt to feel like the outcast, how much I wanted them to be a part of my wedding, and how I hoped we could find a way back to being a family. I hit send and waited, checking my phone every few hours, hoping for a reply. But just like before, there was nothing. My fiancé tried to cheer me up, telling me we didn't need them to have a great wedding, but the silence still stung. The day before the wedding, we had our rehearsal at the venue. It was supposed to be a low-stress way to run through the ceremony, but it turned into a disaster. My parents and Megan showed up uninvited, catching us completely off guard. They didn't come with smiles or warm greetings, they came with accusations. My mom started in right away, saying I'd been trying to push them away on purpose, that I'd made everything difficult for them. Megan was right behind her, throwing out more accusations about how I had abandoned the family when they needed me most. My fiance tried to keep things calm, stepping in to ask them to leave if they couldn't be supportive. But that only made things worse. My dad, who had been quiet until then, stepped forward and accused me of turning my back on the family for my fiance, like I had chosen a new life over them. His voice got louder, and I could feel everyone's eyes on us, including our friends who had come to help with the rehearsal. I had reached my limit. I laid it all out there, listing all the sacrifices I'd made over the years, moving back to town, sending money to help them, paying for Megan's tuition, even when she treated me like a stranger. I didn't hold back. But my mom just looked at me, shaking her head. She told me I'd always thought I was better than them, that I never truly understood what the family had been through. It felt like all my efforts meant nothing to them. At that point, my fiance asked them to leave one last time, making it clear that this was our day and that they couldn't ruin it. My parents walked out, Megan right behind them, and Chris lingered for a moment. He looked at me with an apologetic expression, like he wanted to say something, but in the end, he just followed them out the door. That night, I posted another update on Reddit, describing what had happened at the rehearsal. I wasn't looking for sympathy, but I needed to get it off my chest. The responses flooded in, with people urging me to let go of the toxic relationship with my family and focus on starting my new life. Some even shared their own stories about cutting off family and finding peace afterward. It helped to see that I wasn't alone, but it didn't make the situation any easier. The next morning, I woke up determined to go through with the wedding, even if my family wasn't there. My fiance and I deserved this day, and I wasn't going to let their negativity ruin it. I didn't know if they'd show up again or cause more drama, but I was ready to face whatever came next. Standing at the altar, I realized that this was the first time in a long while where I felt like I had some control over my life. As the ceremony went on, I tried to focus on the people who had shown up for us, our friends, my fiance's family, the ones who really cared. For the first time, I wasn't looking over my shoulder, wondering what my parents or Megan might think. By the time we reached the reception, I knew there was no going back to the way things were with my family. Maybe they'd never understand why I'd made the choices I did, but I couldn't keep putting my own life on hold, hoping they'd come around. The chapter with my family might be closing, but I was ready to start a new one, even if it meant leaving them behind. Update 4. The morning of my wedding, I woke up feeling a mix of nerves and hope. My fiance and I had planned every detail, and our friends were there to support us. Despite everything with my family, I wanted to believe this day could still be special. My fiance's family arrived early, helping set up at the venue. I was surrounded by laughter and excitement, but I couldn't help but feel the absence of my own family. About an hour before the ceremony, I was checking last-minute details when Chris showed up. He looked a little out of place among the cheerful guests, but he was alone, no sign of our parents or Megan. He pulled me aside, and for the first time in a long while, he looked genuinely sorry. He admitted that he'd struggled to stand up to our parents, and that he knew they'd always treated me unfairly. He said he came because he thought I deserved to have at least one family member there on my big day. It was a strange moment, seeing my brother there, trying to make things right in his own way. I hesitated, wondering if I should really trust him after everything. But in the end, I decided to let him stay. I told him he could attend the ceremony. I couldn't read too much into it. Maybe he really meant what he said this time. I hoped so. The ceremony started soon after. I focused on my fiancé, trying to push everything else out of my mind. But as we were saying our vows, I noticed them, my parents and Megan, standing off to the side of the venue, just far enough that they weren't part of the crowd. They watched, but they didn't come closer. My fiancé saw them too, and I could tell she was worried they might cause trouble. She asked quietly if I wanted them escorted out, but I shook my head. It was easier to ignore them than to make a scene. We managed to get through the ceremony without any interruptions. As we walked back down the aisle together, I tried to focus on the moment, on my fiancé's smile and the cheers from our friends, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. At the reception, things took a turn. My parents didn't join in, but they lingered nearby, clearly watching. It wasn't long before my mom made her move, approaching me when I was greeting guests. Before she could get too close, Megan cut in, raising her voice so everyone nearby could hear. She accused me of turning Chris against the family, of manipulating him to be on my side. She went on, bringing up old grievances and trying to paint me as the villain. People started to notice, turning their heads toward the commotion. My fiancé saw what was happening and tried to step in, but Megan wasn't having it. My dad joined in, adding fuel to the fire, saying that I was abandoning my family just to make a show of it. It didn't take long for the situation to spiral into a full-blown argument, right in the middle of what was supposed to be our celebration. The noise drew even more attention, and soon enough, the atmosphere shifted from joyful to tense. My fiancé's parents and friends looked confused and uncomfortable, clearly unsure of how to react to the scene unfolding. My fiancé tried to calm things down, but it was no use. Security, who we had hired just in case, finally had to step in and ask my parents and Megan to leave. They argued, but eventually they were escorted out. After they left, the air was heavy, but I wasn't going to let them ruin everything. I picked up the microphone and gave a speech, something I hadn't planned but felt was necessary. I thanked my fiancé, our friends, and everyone who had been there for us through all the chaos. I talked about how grateful I was to have people who truly supported us and how much it meant to start this new chapter surrounded by those who cared. A few guests teared up and the tension started to lift. When I finished, there was a moment of silence before the applause. It wasn't the reception I had imagined, but at least it felt like a step forward. I couldn't help but notice Chris standing off to the side, looking uncertain. He stayed through the rest of the reception, but he didn't say much. After the last of the guests had left and the reception wound down, Chris approached me. He apologized again, saying he was sorry for how things had turned out and that he wished he could have done more to make peace. He promised to stay in touch and said he'd try to talk to our parents, though I wasn't sure what difference it would make at this point. We shook hands before he left, and it felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a chance we could repair things someday if he was willing to try. With the drama behind us, my fiancé and I finally left for our honeymoon. As the plane took off, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. We spent a week away, exploring new places and enjoying the break from all the family chaos. I found a moment to post an update on Reddit, sharing what had happened at the wedding. I told them about how my parents and Megan had shown up uninvited, about the scene they caused, and how Chris had tried to make amends. It felt strange to be sharing something so personal with strangers, but their support had meant a lot over the past few months. The responses came in quickly, with people encouraging me to focus on my new life and reminding me that sometimes the best thing you can do is walk away. A few shared their own stories of going through similar experiences, and it made me feel less alone. For the first time in a while, I felt like I had made the right choice. By the time we returned home, I was ready to put the past behind me. I knew the family drama wasn't over, but I wasn't going to let it take over my life anymore. I had a future to build with my fiancée, a new family that we would create together, and that was what mattered most now. It wasn't the ending I had hoped for, but it was a start, and that was enough for me. Update 5. After the wedding and our honeymoon, my fiancé and I returned home feeling recharged. We were ready to focus on building our life together, but the lingering thoughts of my family stayed with me. Chris kept in touch, reaching out more than he had before. He would send me updates about our parents, though his messages were often filled with tension. According to him, they still refused to talk about me or even acknowledge that I'd reached out before the wedding. It was clear the rift hadn't healed, but I tried not to let it consume me. A few weeks after we settled back in, Chris mentioned something that caught my attention. Our mom's health had taken a turn. He didn't go into detail, just said she had been in and out of the doctor's office lately. Part of me felt a pang of worry, but I held back from getting involved. I wasn't ready to dive back into their lives, not after everything that had happened. My fiancé reminded me that it was okay to protect myself from being hurt again, but the thought lingered. Then, amidst the ongoing family drama, something unexpected happened at work. My boss called me into the office and offered me a promotion. It was a huge step up, more responsibility, better pay, and a chance to take on new challenges. For the first time in a while, I felt like I had something to look forward to that wasn't overshadowed by the mess with my family. My fiancé and I celebrated quietly at home, planning what we'd do with the extra income, like saving up for a new place. But just when I thought things might be settling down, I received an unexpected phone call one evening. It was my father. His voice sounded different, quieter, almost hesitant. He asked if we could meet for coffee, saying he wanted to talk. I hadn't heard him sound like this in years, and it threw me off. I was skeptical, but a part of me hoped maybe he had realized how badly things had gone between us. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him. We met at a small cafe downtown, the kind of place where the staff knows all the regulars. The conversation started awkwardly. He fumbled with his words, apologizing for things he had never acknowledged before. He said that maybe they had been too hard on me over the years, that they didn't realize how much it hurt to feel like I was always on the outside. He didn't try to justify their behavior, just stumbled through what sounded like a genuine attempt at making amends. I listened, but it was hard to ignore the years of hurt. An apology now, after all this time, felt like trying to put a band-aid on a wound that never quite healed. I could see he was trying, though, and I told him I appreciated the effort. But I also made it clear that things couldn't just go back to how they were. If I was going to have a relationship with them, it would have to be different. He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't sure how to take it. Meanwhile, Megan stayed silent. I tried reaching out to her, just a simple message asking if she wanted to catch up, but she didn't respond. Then I noticed she had blocked me on social media altogether. It stung, but at this point, I was getting used to it. I mentioned it to Chris, and he tried to mediate again, saying he'd talk to her. I warned him that I wasn't going to put up with being treated like the villain anymore. He promised he'd try to keep the peace, but I wasn't holding my breath. A few days after that awkward coffee meeting, my father called again. This time, his voice was more urgent. He asked me to consider visiting my mom. He said that she had been struggling a lot, that she was deeply affected by the distance between us. He sounded desperate, like he didn't know what else to do. I could hear the strain in his voice, but I still didn't know if I was ready to step back into that world. I talked it over with my fiancée. She reminded me that I didn't have to make any decisions out of guilt, but she also said she'd support me if I chose to give them another chance. It was a tough call. Part of me wanted to see my mom to make sure she was okay, but the other part of me knew how easily I could get pulled back into their orbit. So like before, I turned to Reddit. I laid out everything. How my dad had reached out, how he wanted me to visit my mom, and how conflicted I felt. The responses were all over the place. Some people told me to stay strong and protect myself, that my family had shown their true colors enough times. Others said that life was too short and that I might regret not seeing my mom if her health got worse. It didn't make my decision any easier, but it was a relief to hear from people who understood where I was coming from. In the end, I decided I would visit my mom, but I set some boundaries. I I told my dad over the phone that I would meet her, but only if we kept things civil and focused on her health, not the past. I made it clear that I wasn't coming back to be their emotional punching bag again. He agreed, sounding relieved, and we set a time to meet at their house. As I drove over to my parents' place for the first time in months, I couldn't help but wonder what would come of this visit. I didn't know if it would change anything between us or if it would just be another chapter in our messy history, but I was prepared to see it through, whatever happened next. I knew that no matter how the meeting went, I had my own life to focus on, my own future to build. When I pulled up to their driveway, I took a deep breath and knocked on the door. This time, I was ready for whatever came next. Whether it was a new beginning or just another reminder of why I had walked away, I knew I had the strength to face it and move forward. I'm a 29-year-old guy who never expected my life to turn into a twisted family drama, but here we are. To give you some context, I come from a wealthy family that, on the outside, seemed perfect. My dad passed away 2 years ago, and that's when everything started unraveling. My mother, 56F, is manipulative, to put it mildly. I have an older sister, Julia, 32F, who has always been the golden child. Then there's Aaron, 26M, the youngest, who never took anything seriously. I guess you could say I was the responsible middle child, but I never realized just how much of a role that would play. After my father's passing, we gathered for the will reading. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, but what I heard shocked me. My father had left the majority share of the family business to me. Julia and Aaron received smaller portions, while I was given control of the entire operation. This wasn't a small thing. Our family business was our main source of wealth, even though it had been struggling recently due to mismanagement, mostly on Julia's part. I could see the shock on their faces. Julia gave me this tight, forced smile, like she was trying to keep it together, and Aaron just sat there, stunned. At first, they seemed supportive, or at least they pretended to be. My mother's reaction was strange, though. She said it was unexpected but fair, but her smile never reached her eyes. I could tell she wasn't happy about it. It didn't take long for the subtle manipulation to start. Over the next few months, my family began making little comments here and there, trying to make me question the will. They'd say things like Dad wasn't really himself towards the end, or he was so forgetful those last few months, who knows what he really wanted. It was like they were planting seeds of doubt in my mind, hoping they'd grow. Julia took it a step further. She invited me out for dinner one night, just the two of us. She made it seem like it was a chance for us to bond as siblings, but I quickly realized she had an agenda. She started talking about how Dad always wanted us to be equal, how he believed in fairness. She suggested that we split the inheritance evenly among the three of us. She said it would be the right thing to do, and that Dad would have wanted us to stick together. I didn't know what to say. It felt like she was trying to rewrite what had actually happened, but she was so confident about it that I almost believed her. Then Aaron jumped on the bandwagon. He started backing Julia up, saying he remembered Dad talking about splitting everything equally. It was confusing because I had completely different memories. I remember Dad telling me he trusted me to take care of the business, that he believed I was the only one who could handle it. But now my own siblings were telling me I was wrong, that I had misunderstood. They made it sound like I was the one twisting things around. It was like they were gaslighting me, and for a moment, I started to doubt myself. I decided I needed some outside advice, so I went to see a lawyer. I explained the situation, and the lawyer assured me that the will was airtight. He said it would be hard for anyone to contest it, but he warned me that inheritance disputes can get messy. I wasn't sure if I should tell my siblings about this meeting yet, so I decided to keep it to myself for the time being. Things escalated when my mother got involved. She started pulling me aside during family gatherings, telling me stories about how my dad supposedly regretted not dividing the assets equally. She'd say things like, "Your father didn't want this kind of division in the family, and, he never wanted one of you to feel left out." It was clear she was trying to guilt trip me. She made it sound like I was the one causing all the problems, like I was the one tearing the family apart by not agreeing to split everything evenly. The gaslighting only got worse from there. Julia and Aaron began rewriting family history right in front of me. They'd talk about how I was always Dad's favorite, how he gave me special treatment my whole life. It was completely untrue, but they said it with such conviction that it made me question my own memories. They started excluding me from family plans and events, making me feel like the outsider in my own family. It was a weird and disorienting experience, like they were trying to push me out. I started to wonder if I had missed something all these years. Had Dad really favored me? Was I just blind to it? I decided to reach out to a family friend who was close to my father. I needed to hear from someone who wasn't directly involved. When I asked him, he was clear my father had intentionally left me the majority share because he believed I was the only one who could handle the business. He said Dad had seen the way Julia and Aaron acted and didn't trust them to make good decisions. Armed with this new information, I decided to confront my siblings. We had a tense family meeting where I brought up what the family friend had told me. Julia immediately dismissed it, saying the friend was old and probably confused. Aaron looked uncomfortable but didn't contradict her. My mother, on the other hand, had a full-blown meltdown. She started crying, accusing me of disrespecting my father's legacy, saying this wasn't what he would have wanted. It was so over the top that I didn't know how to respond. At that point, I realized I needed to step back. I couldn't keep dealing with the manipulation and the gaslighting. I decided to go low contact with all of them. I started documenting every interaction, keeping a record of every conversation related to the inheritance. I thought that might be the end of it, but then I got a cryptic message from an estranged uncle, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. He said he had information that could change everything, and now I'm left wondering what new secret is about to come out. Update 1. After getting that cryptic message from my estranged uncle, I felt like I had no choice but to meet him. He's my dad's brother, someone who had a falling out with the family years ago. We met up in a small cafe on the outskirts of town. It was awkward at first, like meeting a stranger who knew all your secrets. But once we got past the small talk, he got straight to the point. He told me that my family had a history of inheritance drama, and this wasn't the first time my mother and Julia had tried something like this. When my grandmother passed away years ago, the same thing happened. My mother and Julia manipulated the situation, convincing everyone that the will was unclear. They ended up getting a much larger share than what was intended, and my uncle got pushed out. He said it was the main reason he cut ties with the family. Hearing this was like a punch to the gut. It made me realize that this wasn't just about me. They'd been playing these games for years. Then, my uncle pulled out a folder from his bag. He handed it over to me, saying I needed to see what was inside. I opened it and found a stack of documents. They were financial records, showing that Julia and Aaron had been funneling money out of the family business long before our dad even got sick. Personal expenses disguised as business development, luxury vacations, and even some shady consultant fees paid to themselves. This explained why the business had been declining so much. It wasn't just bad management, it was outright theft. My uncle didn't stop there. He told me he believed my mother was behind the whole scheme. He described her as the puppet master, using Julia and Aaron as pawns to manipulate the family's assets. He warned me that things could get a lot worse if I didn't act quickly. He said he'd seen it all before, and that they wouldn't stop until they got everything they wanted. It felt like I was uncovering layers of a plot I didn't even know I was part of. I knew I had to take these documents to my lawyer. When I showed them to him, he looked through them carefully, flipping page after page in silence. He finally leaned back and said that this was solid evidence of financial misconduct. He advised me to take legal action immediately to protect my inheritance and prevent them from draining the business dry. I didn't want to believe my family could do this, but the proof was right there in front of me. Armed with the documents, I confronted Julia and Aaron at a family meeting. I laid everything out on the table, showing them the evidence. Julia didn't even flinch. She just smirked and accused me of fabricating the documents. Aaron, on the other hand, looked like he'd seen a ghost. He kept glancing at Julia, then back at me, but he didn't say a word. It was like he was trapped between loyalty to her and fear of the truth coming out. My mother's response was even worse. She went straight into gaslighting mode, calling me paranoid and saying that the uncle who gave me the documents was a known liar. She started telling old family stories, painting me as the troubled one who always misunderstood Dad's intentions. It was like she had a script ready, twisting the narrative to make me look like the villain. Not long after that, I started getting messages from extended family, cousins, aunts, uncles, all accusing me of trying to steal the inheritance that rightfully belonged to Julia and Aaron. Turns out, Julia had already started a smear campaign against me, spreading lies that I was manipulating the situation for my own gain. It was clear I was being isolated, and the gaslighting was working on everyone else. At that point, I felt like I was backed into a corner. I decided I needed to go no contact with all of them. I told my lawyer to handle any communication from now on. It wasn't easy, but I knew it was the only way to protect myself. We filed a lawsuit to freeze the family business assets, effectively stopping Julia and Aaron from siphoning off any more money. The backlash was immediate. I was bombarded with angry calls and messages, but I held my ground. Then, something unexpected happened. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years reached out. They said they'd seen the manipulation firsthand and were sick of staying silent. They sent me a recorded conversation where Julia admitted she knew about the inheritance plan all along and was just trying to get me to give up my share. It was the first real piece of support I'd received, and it felt like a lifeline. The family drama hit a new level when my mother had a public meltdown at a family event. She started yelling about how I was tearing the family apart, calling me disloyal and ungrateful. People pulled out their phones, and the whole scene was caught on video. It spread through the extended family like wildfire. It was humiliating, but it also showed everyone just how manipulative she could be. Feeling overwhelmed, I decided to share my story on Reddit. I posted everything, from the gaslighting to the financial documents redacted, of course. The response was incredible. Thousands of people commented, sharing their own experiences and offering support. It was validating to know I wasn't alone in dealing with a manipulative family. Meanwhile, my lawyer made a new discovery, a hidden account in my mother's name with large sums of money transferred out of the business. It was more evidence of her deception, and it solidified my resolve to keep fighting. I knew I couldn't back down now. The update ends with subpoenas being issued for Julia and Aaron's financial records. I'm nervous about what comes next, but for the first time I feel ready to take this fight to court. This isn't just about the inheritance anymore, it's about exposing the truth.
Update 2. The subpoenas went out faster than I expected. My lawyer made sure Julia, Aaron, and my mother were all served at the same time. It was like dropping a bomb into the middle of the family group chat. Messages started pouring in, with Julia and my mother leading the charge. They accused me of dragging our family's name through the mud, calling me greedy and selfish. I just kept my phone on silent, knowing there was no point in engaging. A few days later, I found out my mother had hired a high-profile lawyer. This guy's known for handling nasty inheritance disputes. He's the kind of lawyer you get when you want to win at all costs. Then, I got hit with a counterclaim. My mother was now accusing me of manipulating my father in his final months, saying I'd influenced him into giving me the majority share of the inheritance. It felt like they were throwing everything they had at me, hoping something would stick. While I was dealing with that mess, my lawyer uncovered new evidence. He found large withdrawals from the family business account made by my mother and Julia right before the will was read. They were labelled as charity donations, but there was no record of any actual charities receiving the money. It was clear they'd been siphoning off funds for themselves. My lawyer suspected this was part of a bigger plan to drain the business dry before I took control. Then, out of nowhere, I got a call from my estranged aunt, my mother's sister. She cut ties with the family years ago, and I barely remembered her. She said she'd heard about what was happening and wanted to help. We met up, and she handed me a stack of printed emails. In these emails, my mother and Julia discussed their strategy for managing me, making sure I wouldn't interfere with their plans. It was all there in black and white, how they planned to isolate me and discredit anything I said. My aunt told me this wasn't the first time they'd done something like this, and that's why she walked away from the family years ago. The fallout was immediate. Word spread among the extended family, and people started taking sides. Some relatives reached out to ask if the emails were real, clearly starting to doubt my mother's narrative. But others doubled down, accusing me of betraying the family. The whole thing turned toxic fast. Family gatherings became battlegrounds, with heated arguments breaking out whenever my name was mentioned. I decided to stop attending altogether. There was no point in walking into a trap when I knew they were just looking for more ammunition to use against me. The stress started taking a toll on me. I wasn't sleeping, and my anxiety was through the roof. I booked more sessions with my therapist, who helped me see the patterns of manipulation and control. It was like a light bulb went off. They'd been gaslighting me for so long that I didn't even recognize it anymore. Meanwhile, Julia ramped up her social media campaign. She started posting cryptic messages and photos, painting herself and my mother as the victims. There were posts about family betrayal and how money changes people. She didn't mention me by name, but it was obvious who she was talking about. The posts gained a lot of traction, and mutual friends started reaching out, asking if everything was okay. It was exhausting trying to defend myself against lies without stooping to her level. Then, something unexpected happened. Aaron showed up at my place one night, looking like he hadn't slept in days. He broke down and confessed that he felt trapped. He admitted that Julia and our mother pressured him into backing their story. He said our mother promised to pay off his debts if he sided with them. I didn't say much, just listened and nodded. But I had my phone recording the whole conversation in my pocket. I knew I'd need that as evidence later. After Aaron's confession, I realized it was time to go public. I took to Reddit, posting an update about what was happening. I shared redacted screenshots of the emails, the financial documents, and even the recording of Aaron's confession. The post went viral. Thousands of people commented, sharing their own stories of family manipulation and legal battles. It was overwhelming, but also incredibly validating. The community's support gave me the boost I needed to keep fighting. A few days after the post blew up, I got a long, emotional letter from my mother. It was full of flowery language about how she wanted to make amends, how she wanted us to have a private family discussion, to sort things out. My lawyer told me not to respond. It was probably just another tactic to coerce me into dropping the lawsuit. I ignored it. Then came the bombshell. A secret recording of a family meeting got leaked online. In the audio, you can hear my mother and Julia talking about their plans to break me, discussing ways to pressure me into signing over my share of the business. The backlash was immediate. The audio spread on social media, and people were outraged. I started getting messages from former employees of the family business telling me about financial mismanagement and bullying by Julia. They offered to provide affidavits, strengthening my legal case even more. Feeling the pressure, Aaron decided to switch sides officially. He told me he wanted to testify against our mother and Julia, admitting he was coerced into lying. It was a huge turning point, and I felt like the tide was finally starting to turn. The family insisted on having one last meeting to resolve everything. I knew it was a trap, so I brought my lawyer along as a witness. Things escalated quickly. Julia got in my face, screaming that I was ruining her life. She even shoved me at one point, which my lawyer recorded as evidence. The update ends with a new twist. I received a court summons. My mother has filed a new lawsuit against me, accusing me of defamation and emotional distress. It feels like they're pulling out all the stops now, but I'm ready. The real fight is about to begin. Update 3. As we geared up for the courtroom battle, the pressure mounted. My lawyer and I spent hours going over every piece of evidence we had gathered: financial records, the emails from my estranged aunt, recordings of Aaron's confession, and the leaked audio of the family meeting. It was a mountain of evidence, and we knew we needed to present it clearly if we wanted any chance of winning. By the time the trial date rolled around, the case had gained local media attention. Reporters hovered outside the courthouse, and the family's dirty laundry was becoming public knowledge. Julia was the first to take the stand. She walked up like she was entering a theatre stage, looking every bit the victim. She started off with a sob story about how she sacrificed her career for the family business and how I supposedly twisted my father's wishes to steal everything from her and Heron. It was like watching a badly rehearsed play. She kept glancing at the jury, pausing for effect, wiping fake tears. Her story was full of holes, though. She claimed Dad wanted everything split equally, but had no evidence to back it up. The more she spoke, the more insincere it sounded. I could see the jury shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Then it was my turn. I took a deep breath, walked up to the stand, and started laying it all out. I showed the documents proving the financial misconduct, withdrawals disguised as charity donations, money funneled into personal accounts, and fake consultant fees. I played the recording of Aaron's confession where he admitted to being coerced by our mother. The courtroom went silent as I played the audio of the family meeting, where my mother and Julia discussed their plan to break me. You could see the shock on people's faces. It felt like the entire narrative they'd been pushing had just crumbled to dust. The biggest twist came when Aaron took the stand. He looked nervous, but there was a certain resolve in his eyes. He admitted everything. He confessed that our mother had promised him a large sum of money if he lied in court and supported her story. He apologized to me in front of everyone, saying he couldn't live with the lies anymore. It was a bombshell, and you could see the impact it had on the jury. Even the judge seemed taken aback. Aaron's testimony was a turning point. It was clear now that this wasn't just a family dispute. It was a full-blown conspiracy. My mother didn't take it well. She interrupted the proceedings, accusing the judge of being biased, shouting that the entire courtroom was against her. The judge had to warn her to stay quiet or risk being held in contempt. It was like watching someone desperately try to keep control of a sinking ship. Her credibility took a nosedive right then and there. Next up, my lawyer presented the final piece of the puzzle, evidence of fraudulent transfers and embezzlement. The documents showed how my mother and Julia had been funneling money into offshore accounts for years. We traced the funds through a complex web of transactions, proving that they had been skimming off the top long before Dad's death. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. It was irrefutable. As if that wasn't enough, the family friend who had warned me earlier took the stand. He testified that my father explicitly told him he wanted me to inherit the majority share because he trusted me to handle the business responsibly. This directly contradicted everything my mother and Julia had claimed. It was another blow to their already crumbling case. During cross-examination, my lawyer revealed something none of us had seen coming: a hidden trust fund set up by my father. It was designed as a safeguard, only to be activated if the main inheritance was contested. The trust transferred even more assets to me as a way of protecting the business from exactly the kind of drama we were dealing with now. You could see Julia's face go pale as this new revelation hit. It was like the final nail in the coffin. At this point, even my mother's lawyer seemed to realize the case was lost. He stood up and requested to withdraw, citing irreconcilable differences with his client. The courtroom was left in shock. My mother had to represent herself, and she looked like she'd been abandoned in the middle of a storm. The trial became a media circus. Local news outlets picked up on the explosive revelations, and public opinion shifted sharply in my favor. The narrative of the ungrateful son had flipped. Now, people saw me as the one who had been wronged, fighting against a manipulative family. Julia had a complete breakdown on the stand. She started crying, admitting that she felt entitled to the inheritance because she believed she'd given up everything for the family business. She finally realized she had lost everything: her credibility, her reputation, and any chance of getting what she wanted. The judge delivered a scathing ruling against my mother and Julia. He ordered them to repay the stolen funds and granted me full control of the family business and the hidden trust fund. The courtroom erupted in whispers and murmurs as the ruling was announced. It felt like justice had finally been served. As the trial wrapped up, my mother made one last attempt to reach out. She approached me, begging for forgiveness and asking if we could settle things privately. I didn't even respond. I just walked away, knowing there was nothing left to say. I decided right then and there to cut ties completely. I blocked my mother and Julia's numbers and sent a final message to the family group chat explaining my decision. I wasn't going to let them back into my life after everything they'd done. Just when I thought it was all over, a letter arrived at my lawyer's office. It was from an anonymous source, hinting at even more hidden assets and secrets left behind by my father. It seemed like the battle might not be over after all.
Update 4. A week after the trial ended, I thought I could finally breathe. Then, a letter arrived at my lawyer's office. It wasn't an ordinary letter. There was no return address, just a plain envelope with my name typed on it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a cryptic message about a secret legacy left by my father. The letter claimed only I could access it and hinted that I'd missed something important in the original will. I took the letter straight to my lawyer. We spent hours revisiting the old documents, digging through every clause and line. That's when we found it, a vague reference to an undisclosed account labeled as a legacy fund. It was buried deep in the legal jargon, designed to be activated only if the main inheritance was contested. It was like my father had anticipated the family drama and set up a safety net just for me. We decided to bring in a forensic accountant to dig deeper. Within days, the forensic accountant found the hidden legacy fund. It was much bigger than the original inheritance, significantly more. The fund was carefully hidden, with multiple layers of protection. It was almost as if my father had gone out of his way to ensure no one else would know about it unless they truly needed it. The accountant explained that this kind of setup is rare but often used when there's a high risk of legal battles or disputes over the main estate. My father clearly knew what was coming. But before I could even process this new discovery, the situation escalated again. Somehow, the information about the legacy fund leaked, and my mother found out. She immediately filed an emergency motion to contest the new fund, claiming it was a mistake. Her argument? That my father never intended for me to have it all, and that it should be split equally among the siblings. It was a desperate move, but I knew she wasn't going to back down without a fight. While dealing with the legal chaos, I got an unexpected message from Julia. She wanted to meet privately, away from the lawyers and the courts. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity. When we met, she looked exhausted, like the stress was finally catching up with her. Julia admitted she knew about the legacy fund all along and confessed that she planned to use it to secure her financial future once she got control of the business. She claimed our mother manipulated her, and now she wanted a second chance to make things right. It felt strange, hearing her say this after everything she'd done. I wasn't sure what to do next. Despite everything, I still remembered the bond we shared as kids. I ended up discussing it with my therapist, who helped me see through Julia's words. It was likely another attempt at manipulation, just with a different tactic this time. It was becoming clearer that I couldn't trust her, no matter how sincere she seemed. Then, Aaron showed up at my door one evening, completely unannounced. He handed me a USB drive, looking more apologetic than I'd ever seen him. On the drive were emails between Julia and our mother, discussing their plans to manipulate me and claim the legacy fund. They talked about isolating me, spreading lies, and dragging the legal battle out for years if necessary. Aaron apologized again, saying he was done playing their games and wanted to start fresh. It was hard not to feel a tiny bit of relief hearing this from him. My lawyer reviewed the new evidence and warned me that things were about to get even messier. If my mother continued to push her claim, we could be tied up in court battles for years. He suggested we strategize and even consider going public with the new information if needed. We decided to keep this option as a last resort. The court ordered a family mediation session before moving forward with the new case. I agreed to go, even though I knew it was probably a waste of time. The session was a disaster from the start. My mother walked in, glaring at me like I was the enemy. She launched into a tirade, accusing me of being brainwashed by my lawyer, saying I was destroying the family. It quickly turned into a shouting match, with the mediator struggling to keep control. Then my mother dropped a bombshell. She pulled out a document, claiming it was proof that my father intended for the legacy fund to be split equally among all three of us. My lawyer took one look at it and immediately pointed out inconsistencies. The signature looked off, and the formatting was completely different from any of my father's other documents. We knew it was a fake. The court called in a handwriting expert to examine the document. It didn't take long for them to debunk it. The expert testified that the signature had been copied and pasted from an old contract, exposing my mother's latest attempt at deception. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. News of the forged document spread like wildfire. Within hours, social media exploded with outrage, and the hashtag #JusticeForOp started trending on Twitter. The public backlash was swift and harsh. People were furious that my mother would stoop this low. Aaron decided it was time to speak up publicly. He posted a long apology on his social media, distancing himself from our mother and Julia. He admitted his mistakes and expressed his support for my fight for justice. His post went viral, gaining thousands of comments from people who had been following our story. Finally, the judge made a ruling on the legacy fund. He declared me the sole beneficiary, dismissing my mother's claims with prejudice, meaning she couldn't contest it again. It was over, at least this part of the battle was. As the court session ended, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But just when I thought I could finally close this chapter, I got a voicemail from my mother. Her voice was calm, almost eerie. She hinted at yet another hidden secret involving the family business, something she claimed I still didn't know about. I played the message twice, feeling a sense of unease. It looks like there might be more to uncover after all. Update 5. After listening to my mother's cryptic voicemail about another hidden secret, I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't bluffing. I hired a private investigator to look into the financial history of the family business. If there was more to uncover, I needed it all out in the open. The investigator got to work quickly, diving deep into old records and transactions. The results were shocking. He discovered a shell company set up under a fake name, one that was directly tied back to my mother. For years, she had been siphoning profits from the family business into this shell company. It was clever, set up to look like an external consulting firm, with fake invoices and payments. She had effectively drained the business dry, taking far more than what was revealed during the court case. The total amount stolen was staggering, far exceeding what anyone could have imagined. I brought this new evidence to my lawyer, and we immediately filed a lawsuit against my mother for embezzlement and fraud. The media caught wind of the new case, and it quickly gained widespread coverage. The once private family drama was now a public spectacle, with every new detail making headlines. My mother's reputation, already in tatters from the previous trial, took a nosedive. People couldn't believe the lengths she had gone to manipulate and steal. Meanwhile, Julia's downfall was swift. Without the financial support from the siphoned funds, she found herself facing bankruptcy. She tried to play the victim again, posting on social media about how she was betrayed by family and left with nothing. This time, though, the public wasn't buying it. The tide had turned completely. Former friends and colleagues started sharing their own negative experiences with her, stories of her bullying, manipulation, and deceit. It was clear she had burned every bridge she ever had. My mother tried to fight back in the public eye, making a statement to the press denying all allegations. She even scheduled a live interview, probably hoping to sway public opinion one last time. Instead, it ended in disaster. During the interview, she had a complete meltdown, accusing me of being brainwashed by outside influences and claiming I was out to destroy her. The video went viral, but not in the way she hoped. It cemented her image as manipulative and unstable. The comments were brutal, with most people calling her out for her lies and deception. As the legal battles played out, something unexpected happened. I started receiving messages from extended family members, cousins, aunts, uncles who had been estranged for years. They apologized for doubting me and shared their own stories of manipulation and betrayal by my mother. It was like a floodgate opened. Many of them had distanced themselves long ago, not because they didn't care, but because they couldn't handle her toxic behavior. It was validating to hear, even though it didn't undo the damage she had caused. Aaron and I began rebuilding our relationship during this time. It wasn't easy, but we had both been through a lot. We bonded over the shared trauma and the realization that we had been pawns in a much larger game orchestrated by our mother. We agreed to work together to restore the family business, which was left in ruins after all the drama. We brought back some of the trusted former employees who had been pushed out by Julia and implemented new management practices. Slowly but surely, the business started to recover. It felt good to be honoring my father's legacy the way he intended. After the final lawsuit against my mother was settled, I knew what I had to do. I went permanently no contact with her and Julia. I blocked their numbers and issued a final public statement explaining my decision. I wished them well, but made it clear that I was moving on and would no longer be a part of their lives. It was a clean break, something I needed for my own peace. I continued therapy, working through the years of gaslighting and manipulation I had endured. It wasn't easy, but I started sharing my journey online, hoping to help others who were going through similar situations. I found a surprising amount of support and encouragement from people who had followed my story from the beginning. Aaron took it upon himself to go on what he called an apology tour. He reached out to the people he had wronged during the family dispute, including former business partners, friends, and even me. He wrote a heartfelt letter, which I decided to share on Reddit. It went viral, with thousands of upvotes and positive comments. People were impressed by his honesty and willingness to own up to his mistakes. My lawyer managed to negotiate a final settlement with my mother. She was forced to repay a portion of the embezzled funds, and as part of the agreement, she was permanently barred from having any involvement with the family business. It was a fitting end to her reign of control. With everything finally settled, I decided it was time for a fresh start. I moved to a new city, leaving behind the painful memories of my family drama. I started a new business venture, something completely separate from the old family business. It felt good to be building something on my own terms, without the shadow of manipulation hanging over me. In my final Reddit update, I reflected on everything that had happened. I thanked the community for their unwavering support and shared the lessons I'd learned about manipulation, gaslighting, and the importance of standing up for oneself, even when it's hard. I hinted that I might write a memoir about my experiences, not for the drama, but to help others navigate similar battles. The story ends here, at least for now. I'm looking forward to this new chapter of my life, free from the toxic family dynamics that once held me back. For the first time in a long time, I feel hopeful about the future.